Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the True Life Podcast. I hope that everyone is having a beautiful day. I hope that the sun is shining and the birds are singing and the wind is at your back. I got with me a friend of the show, a friend of mine, an incredible individual. Sorry about that. I have one more. Okay. The For those longtime listeners of the True Life podcast, you will know a huge favorite of mine, and as someone who is a great author, a distinguished scholar with a passion for the history of ideas and a profound commitment to education. With an impressive academic career, he has served as professor of English at Black Hills State University, the Sage Colleges, and now at Christopher Newport University, where he is the founding director of the Office of Undergraduate Research and Creative Activity. Throughout his journey, Dr. Salomon has championed the pursuit of knowledge, embodying what Socrates called a cooperative search for the truth, and his students and colleagues, and we're so thankful to have him here today. His new book, Why Sin Still Matters, is a must read. I would suggest everybody within the sound of my voice run out and grab it now. It'll make you a better person. Dr. David Salomon, how are you today?
Good. It's good to see you again, George. It's been a while.
Yeah, it sure has. We previously we had gone deep into different sort of mystics that we talked about. We had a series on that, and I just kind of wanted to. The word integration has been coming up with me. I've been talking to a lot of people in the startup community who are working on different ways of working in the psychedelic community, but this idea of integration has been something that has been at the forefront of my awareness, and I wanted to talk to you about it today. I know that you are such a incredible scholar on medieval mystics and literature, and you speak all these different languages. I thought, who better a person to talk to about integration? So let me just kind of leave it there for you. When I say integration to you, what do you think about?
Yeah, well, I mean, we were talking offline a little bit, and the sort of the idea of how we might blend together some of the spiritual practices
Yep.
that we've talked about often with everyday life, and the ways in which people have done that in the recent past, and the movement that's afoot, it seems today, to have people really re-engage in those kinds of spiritual practices, reconnect with nature and the world. And so I've been actually talking about that quite a bit with my my honors class this semester. We've kind of tackled the topic of civility and how we can reintroduce civility into the world. And so we've been touching on a lot of issues that relate to how technology dominates modern life, and how that really, in a lot of different ways, it serves as a challenge and an obstacle to really having a better understanding of who you are as a human being. And my students have really embraced this. I've been very impressed. I mean, we're only in the 6th week of class, I think, and we're having some really good discussions, and their eyes are being open to some things that they hadn't thought about previously. I'll give you one example. So one of the very first things I had them do was something which is completely counterintuitive to their daily lives. So we have a really great art gallery on campus here, and just opened a few years ago. And our current exhibition is the sculptures of a woman named Anna Hyatt Huntington. Most people haven't heard of her, 20th century American sculptor. She was actually from this area, from Newport News. And for a while in the early 20th century, she was one of the most famous female sculptors, if not just sculptors, in the world. Her work was being displayed everywhere. It's really impressive. It's mostly animal sculpture.
Okay.
So we have a show that's ongoing right now in our gallery. It actually closes next week, which is essentially a kind of a retrospective of her work. It's an amazing show that our curators put together. They ended up borrowing pieces from 33 different museums, and it chronicles her work from her early days until her death, really. So I had my students do something I was calling the patience exercise. They were to go over there to the exhibit and were to take 25 minutes and pick out a particular piece that they thought was striking. I mean, they were to walk through the entire gallery and then pick out a piece that they thought was particularly engaging and sit in front of that piece for 25 minutes. No phones, no earbuds, no distractions, and just kind of record what they were experiencing and what they were feeling, and then reflect on that a little bit. And then they wrote that up. And their responses were really interesting. I mean, they had said, I mean, that is something that they had never done before. They hadn't realized, some of them said, how much of an intrusion their phones were into their lives until they forced themselves not to look or use them for a finite period of time. I really encourage them to have a sensory experience to engage all their senses. So what did you smell? What did you hear?
Yeah.
What did you see? And it was really kind of eye-opening for them, and eye-opening for me as well. And so I think that speaks to this idea of integration, you know, because my goal with that exercise and with a lot of the other things that we've been talking about in the course is trying to get them to re-engage with the world around them and to figure out how to better integrate daily spiritual practice, regardless of what that might look like, into their lives. And, you know, maybe that is just occasionally saying, you know what, I'm having a really rough day. I need a break from everything. I'm going to go over to the gallery and just sit in the gallery for 20 minutes. Because I've done that.
Yeah.
I mean, I you know, and I guess part of it, well, no, I think I'd come up with the exercise before I did it, but there was a point in the last 8 weeks or so when I was just, everything was just sort of coming at me and it was overwhelming. And I was like, you know what, I need a break. And so I walked over to the gallery without my phone and I sat down in front of one of the pieces for about 20 minutes. And it was a kind of a reset for the day. It was almost a mental hyclonic, right?
Right.
Sort of just clearing out the cobwebs. And it's also, you know, and the other, one of the other things that we've been focusing on is the importance of focus and attention.
Yeah.
You know, they read a chapter from Jenny Odell's book, which is called How to Do Nothing. And I'm having them read some Alan Watts. So you know, various things where they can sort of figure out, how do you engage without, you know, these damn things?
Yeah.
And because they don't know any other way. They're a generation that grew up with cell phones. You know, most of them got their first cell phones, they tell me, when they were in 3rd or 4th grade.
Yep.
Which, you know, it's kind of mind-boggling, but I mean, that's par for the course these days now. And it becomes an appendage. It becomes an extension. You know, I mean, it's trying to remember. It's I think Ron Diebert talks about this in his book. He talks about the fact that basically we've already become cyborgs. You know, because this is really become an extension of our person. You see people walking around and, you know, God forbid they don't have their phone with them. I agree. It is a dumb phone. There isn't much smart about it. I mean, it's funny that you say that, Leiter, because when we first introduced the what we were calling smart boards into the classroom, it was funny because I would go into a classroom and not all the classrooms had them. And so, you know, it was a big whiteboard in front of the room. And I would always wonder, you know, is this a smart board? And, you know, I would tap it and I go, no, it's a stupid board, you know, can't do anything. But yeah, so that's kind of what I've been working on lately. And, you know, it really does sort of connect with a lot of things that we have talked about in the past. You know, I was thinking in particular about somebody like Thomas Merton, who lived his life as a mystic, basically a highly spiritual person, and Merton, who was a Trappist monk, living in America, even though he was born in France, and he, you know, really embraced in the 1960s, in particular, pacifism and civil rights and nonviolence. He opposed nuclear arms, and he wrote 50 books about a variety of topics, but most of them emphasize the importance of contemplation in daily life. And he does have at least one book where he does the crossover into Buddhism. He had I think he co-wrote a book with Suzuki, if I remember correctly. But all of these themes of kind of inner stillness and mindfulness, there are things that are back again in the popular conscious.
Right.
Embracing silence, contemplative awareness, social justice, right? I mean, and the connections between all of these things. And I just think it's kind of interesting how somebody like Merton, and certainly there are others, really aim to try to set an example of how you could affect that integration, as we're saying.
Yeah, it's fascinating to me I getting the idea in my mind of what Viktor Frankl called that moment between stimulus and response.
Yeah.
It's like once and that in itself, the awareness of that moment is spiritual in itself. It's almost like you're reconnecting with your ability to a higher awareness, because you're like, I have a choice in this.
Right.
I can put the phone down. I can sit in front of this painting, which may be 20 minutes, but it could feel like an hour. It could feel like 40 minutes. And the clarity or peace of mind that's achieved in that moment, and then it can be reached back to on some level. It's almost like a state of awareness that you're building, and maybe that's what's atrophied from us for a long time.
Yeah, I mean, and one of my students noted that last night. We were talking about the problems with the cultivation of rare earth metals and the like, and all these technological devices that we have, and what it's doing to the earth. I showed them the Google Earth shot of Bayan Obo in China, and the strip mines that are sitting there that just look like pocks in the earth, And one of my students, interesting, she said, we were talking about consumerism and how that's really driving everything. And she said, this class has really made me stop before buying something and taking a beat and saying, wait a minute, do I really need that? Whereas, normally we live in such a consumerist society, we don't give much thought to that. As you say, that moment between stimulus and response, right? We do everything in a knee-jerk way. And part of that is the current movement that's about slowing down, right? We live in such a fast-paced world, and if we slow down, we can make better decisions. And we can realize, as you just said, that we do have choices.
Yeah. It makes me wonder, when we start talking about the world we live in and consumerism, I can't help but think of fear. Like, it seems to me that fear is the salesman of consumerism. He comes out there, you're not enough. You don't have this. You'll never be this. And in some ways, what we're talking about, this integration, it is the sitting in front peacefully in front of fear and be like, okay, I'm not afraid of you. Standing in front of fear seems to be the antidote to consumerism on some level. Is that make sense?
Yeah. I mean, walking into a store and looking at something and walking away without buying it is like, I mean, for some people, that's like a tremendous accomplishment. Because they're just not used to doing that,
Right.
And it speaks to, and so you say, so one of the things we watched last night in class was I showed them an ad for a new television. Okay. The ad ran in 1958. It's a great ad. It's on YouTube. It's for Philco, Philco, Philco TV, a 1958 ad. And it presents this new television as if it's the Ark of the Covenant. I mean, it really does create this kind of mystical, I mean, the way that it's shown, people are kind of walking around it. It reminded me of the apes at the beginning of 2001 when they find the monolith. It's like they're walking around it, looking at it. It's like, what is this? Oh my gosh. And the great tagline in the commercial It was 1958. And it said it's 1958, but you'll think it's 1965. So this technology that they were introducing was a whole 7 years ahead of its time. But you had to have this, you
Yeah.
know, and this is part of, you know, in the 1950s, the baby boom generation and the rise of affluence after World War II. And the fact that people were buying because they could. And in some ways, we're living, excuse me, we're living in that time again, because, you know, for most folks, and probably most folks who are listening to us, we come from or we live a somewhat privileged life,
Yeah.
you know, and a somewhat affluent life. And as a result, that really does have an impact on not only on us, but on the world around us. You know, I don't know if you've seen the documentary. It's a great documentary that came out right after COVID. It's called "Year the Earth Changed." It's on Apple TV. It was an Apple produced, narrated by David Attenborough. It's a nature documentary about the way the world changed during COVID and the way nature reacted. It's brilliantly done. As I say, I showed it in class last week, and it was the third time I've seen it. And my students were incredibly enthralled. In fact, when it was over, and it's only 48 minutes long, when it was over, and the credits were running, I got up to turn the lights on, and they were just all sitting there. And I said, "I've never heard you all so quiet." I said, "What's your reaction?" Because the point of the film is that during COVID, the animal world reacted in a way that basically was, if they could speak, was, where the hell did everybody go? And it shows how they adapted to this new situation where there were no people around. And it also shows how some animals were able to re-engage in the kinds of existences that they had thousands of years ago, probably before people were intruding. And so when we were done,
Wow.
I said to my students, I said, "So, you know, what do you think? How does this make you feel?" And, you know, they admitted that, I mean, it was a little depressing. And it is a little depressing. And one of them said, you know, it tells us that, you know, we really effed up the world. And we have. But it does end on a somewhat positive note, which is, you know, we can change some of this, even if we just change it in just a minute way. It can make a big difference. So to give you an example, one of the things they show is turtles on the beach. I forget what country it's in, because it's all over the world that they travel. The
Yeah.
turtles, they come on the beach to lay their eggs. And usually the beach is completely taken up with tourists. Well, the
Yeah.
tourists were gone. So now the was more likely that the turtles were going to hatch and survive. And the whole message of it is really kind of interesting. The year the Earth changed, on Apple TV, and I'm not getting any kickbacks. Although David Attenborough could probably, if he'd like to, you know, George has my number.
Yeah.
But it's just, you know, so I think if I mean, I'm in higher ed, so I mean, I
Right.
try to be more intentional and conscious of what I'm putting in front of my students, and I'm not proselytizing. I'm not a Luddite. I'm not saying, you know, all technology is bad. It's just like we talked about with the medieval mystical way. You know, there's complete um a complete ascetic where you just, you know, live like a recluse in a room by yourself. And then, you know, the polar opposite is, well, you're just out in the world and every day and so engaged. And the medieval mystics wanted to find what they called the via media, the middle way.
Right.
And that's what we need to find today. And we're having a lot of hard time doing it because, you know, again, one of my students last night said, because the problem is that we see everything as black and white. We don't see the shades of gray. We're very polarized in many ways, right? And politically as well. We have
Yeah.
a hard time seeing that middle way. And that's really what we need to refine.
Yeah, that brings up a lot of. I've been thinking about this idea about technology, rewilding, COVID, and all the technological mediums that are sort of popping up. And this is something that's kind of, this question is coming to me now as you're talking. It was Philo Judaeus who said that the next logos will be a language to be beheld. And it seems to me on some level, with the technology we have, while maybe making us atrophy in some levels, your ability to put on a somewhat spiritual movie that speaks the language of the earth and shows that to your students. Are we on the cusp of like a new language? It seems to me for the first time, we're beginning to have meaningful communication where people can thoroughly understand the message. And I think the technology is part of that, like the
Yeah.
imagery that's
Yeah.
coming forth.
Yeah.
What's your take on that?
I mean, I would agree with that. I think we're a long way
Right.
from getting there because it's going to have to somehow intrude upon the mainstream. And I don't know if we're there yet. I mean, that's part of the reason why I chose civility as a topic for this course.
Right.
We've got the election coming up, and you know, the death of civil discourse is just mind-boggling.
Yes.
And my fear, and I was afraid of this, you know, years ago, was that this is what our kids were learning, right? I mean, you know, George, you're old enough to know the CSNY, teach your children, right? You know, teach your children well, and it's, you know, what are we teaching our children? And that's something that has, you know, bothered me for some time now when it comes to our political realm. I grew up, you know, in the late 60s, early 70s, and one of the most transforming events in my youth was the resignation of Richard Nixon. Now, that sounds odd. You're like, well, why would that bother a kid? Because up until that time, I had really believed, and I know it's a myth, but I had believed it, that the president was the president. He could pretty much do no wrong. You know, I didn't think he was infallible, but, you know, I held the president up as someone to be respected and admired. And the fall of Richard Nixon, which coincided with a time in my life, in my intellectual and emotional development, when I came to the realization that my father wasn't a god. Those two things together, holy crap, those really pulled the rug out from under you. And I don't think in many ways that mainstream American society has really ever recovered from what happened with first Kennedy, and the supposed, you know, cover up of the assassination and what did really happen, and then Nixon, and then it's just been, it's like we're just on a conveyor belt. It's just like, okay, what's next? You know, okay, so Mayor, you know, Adams of New York City is indicted on felony charge. It's like, what's going on? What's going on? And then when we look at how that then overlaps with the incredible lack of civility in public discourse today, the fact that a former president who is currently running for president can refer to his opponent as mentally impaired. What is that? How do you, I don't know what kind of world that is. And I think that, you know, I think you're right. I mean, I love that line from Philo about, you know, the next logos.
Right.
And, you know, I mean, I think that will come. I think it's going to be slow, because these kinds of things that we're talking about are culture changes, and changes in culture, they take a long time. They don't happen overnight. You know, you know, you could argue it took us a long time to get to this point. It's going to take us a while to get out of it.
Yeah. It's like the big container ship or any kind of a cruise ship. Like you can turn it around, or an
Right.
aircraft carrier, you can turn it around, but It doesn't happen that fast. And
No, no, it's slow, and the ripple effect, speaking of
yeah,
ships,
right.
it doesn't automatically subside right away,
Yeah.
right? I mean, there's still a wake that you have to deal with, as a Hawaii guy.
Yeah.
And so, it's not instant. And so
Right.
I think we wish it would be. I wish we could just flick a switch, but we have to just try to make these small inroads, I think, on an individual level in our lives, in the hopes that eventually, it would become a grassroots movement and take over.
Yeah, well, now we're back to Julian of Norwich, who was like, "All will be well, all will be
Right.
well."
Yeah.
And that brings up the idea of faith, and I see it from where I sit and the people that I talk to is this sort of re-embracing of spirituality, and it comes with rewilding, the same way that documentary showed the animals
Yeah.
rewilding themselves. I see that as a call to action for us as individuals to sort of rewild ourselves, like that which controlled us, or this ideas that we believed in, that we gave so much faith to, that these particular political figures would have our best interest in mind. Like that is part of the ship that's the wake that's moving away from us, and we're like, okay, we went astray, and it's no one person's fault, it's all of our faults. Like, we let it get to this.
Yeah.
And you see the younger generation, in my opinion, that's beginning to re-embrace spirituality, whether it's being a Judist like yourself, or a embracing these incredible ideas of Sufi poetry, and a return to resilience in language and linguistics. Just look at the word trans. It's all over. It's trans
Yeah.
this. But like, isn't that the world talking to us through us? Like, we are in a transition
Mhm.
period. It's is that too heavy, or is that too crazy?
No,
What do you think?
I think that's an astute observation. I think that's probably a good way to look at it.
Yeah,
We are in a period of transition, um, it's on so many levels and in so many
yeah,
spheres. It just, I think, the frightening thing about it is that in so many ways we are in complete control of where that's going to go, and the great fear is what's going to happen, because it doesn't always go the way you hope it's going to go. I mean, I was just
yeah,
reading yet again about the rise of Nazi Germany and how did that happen.
right,
It can easily happen,
right,
and if you don't think it can easily happen, turn on the news. But so I think there is, you're talking about fear earlier on. I mean, I think
yeah,
there is also a big sort of aspect of fear here, of people worrying about what's going to happen. I mean, the kind of the dark humor about it is, well, humanity had a good run, as if this is the end. Um, it seems to be, as you say, a transitional point, and the future will probably look quite different. And we don't know what that is. I mean,
mm,
we have been engaged so much in the last 6 months in talking about AI.
yeah,
Um, and oh my God, it's either the savior and the panacea for
right,
everything, or it's going to kill us all.
right,
Um, and again, it's black or white, right?
right,
No, there's got to be a way to figure out how we can use this in a way that makes sense for us as human beings. It's here, it's not going away. And we've done that so often in our history, with various technological advances going all the way back to the invention of writing.
yeah,
Um, and it's just, I think the difference today is the pace at which it all happens. It just happens so quickly. And the fact that there are more people living on this planet than ever before. And we're crowded. And it's becoming more and more difficult to find space to truly be alone.
Mm-hmm.
There's a guy who does research. I forget where he is. I want to say Yale, but I don't think that's right. And he does research on natural sound.
Okay.
Actually, he was mentioned in Hillel Schwartz's book on sound, which is a great book. He goes out to look for really the last places where you can just hear only natural sound, nothing else. Will
Yeah.
interject. No hum from electrical lines, no airplane flying overhead, and it's becoming increasingly difficult to find any place like that.
Yeah.
It's why I was talking with students about this a couple of weeks ago. It's why if the power goes off in your house, all of a sudden it just seems completely bizarre because it really is quiet, and you don't realize how much background noise there is from all of that stuff that's just running.
Yeah.
The vampire effect of
Yeah.
the refrigerator and the lights and etc. And the interesting thing is that when that does happen, the first way that you notice it in your house is if you have pets. The pets notice it, right? The pets realize it first before you even do. I always think that's kind of interesting and how they react.
Yeah. 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 It's, the same thing with earthquakes or any kind of natural disaster.
Right.
You can see the birds flying away and you're like, uh-oh.
Yeah.
And I can't help but bring it back to language on some level. Like, have we lost the ability to communicate with nature? And is that the spirituality that we're not only longing for, but we've been missing for so long? Like, even if you sit down in front of a painting, you are sitting down in front of something that you labeled as striking. So someone is finding something that speaks to them on a level that is more than words. And
Right.
I think maybe we can. I think that this is a pretty good through line for not only your first book, The 7 Deadly Sins, but why sin still matters. Like, there's a through line to where we're going, and a lot of the research you've done on that. Maybe you could show people that Ariadne thread.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's. I mean, really, the thing that holds all of my work together is this assessment that we need to re-engage in what makes us human beings. We need
Yes.
to re-engage in our humanity, and whether that's, I think, in how we treat each other as human beings, but then on another level, it's also then how we treat the natural world.
Right.
I keep thinking every time there's some horrible natural disaster. I mean, the hurricane that just went through and
Brutal.
just basically has wiped out much of Western North Carolina. It's really unbelievable, which is not far from where I am here in Virginia. It's just absolutely incredible. I mean, the western part of North Carolina, the state is still saying is closed. Don't go there because the roads there you can't get through.
Right.
And whenever something like that happens, I always think that that's in some way the goddess telling us, hey, dummies, what are you doing? And some reaction that the earth is having to the way that we're treating it.
Yeah.
One of the things that's noted in that documentary is that scientists recorded a lower level of sound underground during that COVID lockdown period than they ever had before, because things like fracking and drilling and all of that had stopped. And so, he shows this one scene, and forgive me, I can't remember where these places are. I think this was outside Alaska, where white whales, killer whales, are talking to each other and using more extensive language than they'd ever recorded before, because for the first time the shipping lanes were clear because the ships were all in dry dock because of lockdown, and so they had more freedom. It's just so I think it does speak a lot about the way, and I mean, again, this is the kind of the moral of the story in my book is, it's just the way we lead our lives. How do we lead our lives? What decisions do we make about how we're going to treat each other and treat the world? And I think that for so many people, they're on autopilot when it comes to that. And what we're talking about is taking that beat where you sort of say, wait a minute, stop. I have a choice. Wait a minute, let me look at the choice, right? Maybe this is the better way to go, right? I mean, as you know, Robert Frost said, the road not taken, right? You know, I mean, maybe that's the better choice. I mean, he says it made all the difference, right? In that great poem, that he took the road less traveled by, and
Yeah.
that made all the difference. And so I think for a lot of people that's something that we can learn, is that, you know, sometimes you don't have to just walk on the same path that everybody else is walking on.
Yeah. I'm reminded of the great Arthurian myths, the King Arthur myths, where each individual had to go into a part of the forest that they thought was the darkest part for them. And then they
Yeah.
would have to, and that's where you find the grail, right? That's where
Yeah.
you find
Yeah.
that which calls to you, is by finding that thing that scares you the most, and
Right.
standing in front of it, and making your way on that road less traveled.
And the thing is that going down that path that someone hasn't walked, or going into the dark forest, as you
Yeah.
say, I mean, it's probably going to scare the crap out of you, because you're going to have to confront things that you know had never looked at before. You know, it always reminds me of the great scene in The Empire Strikes Back when Luke goes into the cave and finds Darth Vader, and he kills him, and
Yeah.
when he strikes off his head, it ends up it's Luke, because what he
Yeah.
had to do was he had to confront his shadow self from a Jungian reading,
Yeah.
and really look at that before he could move on. And we don't do that a lot anymore, you know, at least as a rule. It's not something that we often engage in. And now, if we do, it has to be an intentional, conscious choice to do it, because the everyday world and, you know, everyday life is not going to make that happen for you. You're going to have to make it happen, because the world would rather you just go out and buy stuff.
Yes. Yeah. This I think this brings up a fascinating point right here, in that on some level, I think what we're trying to do is to get the individual, at least from my point of view, it seems like this transition is trying to show the youth the hero's journey on some level. Like, look, you and you alone have to slay the dragon. You and you alone have to figure out what it is that's going to make you the best human. But then you have this radical thing called culture. And culture is like, hey, don't rock the boat. Here's these preconceived cutouts of what you can be in life. Just choose one of those.
Yeah.
But no one, you know, a lot of people get it to their 50s and they realize the corporate ladder that they've climbed is up against the wrong wall. Yeah. And you're just like, what is going on? Maybe this is this rite of passage that we see so much in the mystical tradition, this sort of fear and faith, you know, the yin and yang coming together. Maybe that's the transition we're in. Maybe you could speak to this idea a little bit.
Well, it's also about taking a chance, right? I mean,
yes.
You know, the fact is that, you know, when we talk about the medieval mystics in particular, you know, the experiences that they have, if you look at what they went through, I mean, it wouldn't be too much to say that they were brave, because
without a doubt,
you know, when they initially have these experiences, they could easily just say, I'm not going to pay attention to that. I'm just going to keep on doing what I got to do.
Block that off. Pretend I didn't hear it.
But you know, I think it takes a lot of courage to walk off the path that everybody else is already walking, and walk your own path and make your own path, regardless of what that is, whether that's the person who's, you know, as you say, climbing the corporate ladder and realizing I like that, up against the wrong wall, which a lot of people do, right?
Of course,
or even just when you're younger, you know, going into college and deciding that you're going to major in whatever it is, and then finding out that that's not your thing. And it takes a lot of bravery to make that decision to change. And I you know, I really encourage my students to do that. I tell them when they come in, if they've already got this notion about what they want to do with the rest of their lives, that's fantastic. But do not be blind to the other opportunities that might pop up, that all of a sudden you might find something that you're like, oh, I didn't even know that existed. I see students do that all the time. I have a student in one of my classes. She started college as a neuroscience major. She is currently a major in classics.
Nice.
How did she get from point A to point B? Part of it was taking some classes that she didn't do well in, but also figuring out that that's not what she wanted to do. And being brave enough to, change trains, right? Without a transfer, and to just say, well, this isn't the right place for me. I'm going to go over there, and see what that's like. But that takes courage, whether you're 18 or 50 or 60, right? To do that. I think it takes even more courage if you're 50 or 60.
Yeah. I on some level, I feel like it is the courage to embrace uncertainty. And I think that is what's going to turn this big ship around. And I think a lot of youth are. And I think it's like I think that you as a professional, as a teacher, as a scholar, are set aside because you have a lineage of with Miss Dr. Sweeney, I think was one of your mentors.
Sweeney,
And
yes.
yeah, and beyond that, like in your writings, like you practice what you preach, in the level of scholarship by the medieval mystics and being able to speak all the languages. I really think that you are set aside in helping the kids reach this particular activity of finding courage, finding faith. When I read the books, The Seven Deadly Sins or Why Sin Still Matters, there's a very strong connection to faith and courage. And like that, I think, is necessary in order for us to turn this world we're in around right now. It's a good foundation.
Yeah. No, I think you're right. I mean, it is a good time.
Yeah.
And we've got
It's a challenging time.
It's a challenging time, but we've got so many opportunities to
Yes.
change things. And the question is whether or not we're going to do it. Right. I mean, I sound like I sound like Kamala Harris, but there's a lot of opportunities, and it's the question about whether or not we're going to be brave to take them up.
Yeah, I think if people are honest with themselves and they take a moment in silence, or they take a moment where they're alone, they can see that the one thing they suffer from is uncertainty. And if you can see that in yourself, you can apply it to the world we live in today. And a lot of people are afraid, but they're afraid of the uncertainty of what might happen if this person wins, what might happen if this person's win, what happens if this economy goes down. But the truth is, all you can really control is becoming the best version of yourself and finding the courage to switch from neuroscience to classics, or from classics to neuroscience, whatever one it is. But it is this embrace of uncertainty. And I feel like we're in a rite of passage on some level. It seems mystical, and that takes us back to integration in some way.
Yeah, no, I think that's correct. And it's interesting that it is expressing itself in this generation in a very non-conventionally religious way. They're not flocking to church necessarily, or synagogue or the mosque. They're not looking to embrace conventional religion, the conventional religion of their parents or their grandparents. They really are looking at spirituality as a separate thing from religion, which is something I've been talking about for decades. Right? Is that you can be a spiritual person and not be religious.
Right.
And I think that this generation really does understand that.
Yeah. It's interesting. I was in a recent podcast, I was talking with Aiton Koter, he has a platform where they're bringing live shopping. I guess it's like a big craze in China. He was telling about some of the numbers over there and how that seems to be the future of e-commerce. But in our conversation, he had mentioned to me that the younger generation, when they look at the ads, or when they're scrolling through YouTube, or they're looking to buy something, they don't even see the ads. They just swipe right through them. Like, nope, ad. I'm not going to look at any of that. And I thought to myself, like, wow, they're really learning at a level that to try and look for something more meaningful, whether it's in spirituality, whether it's in content. And that gives me hope when I see people are spending a lot more time online. I don't know if we can fix that, but I think that on some level we're learning to look for meaningful content, which that seems to be a bonus to me.
Yeah, I think you're right. I mean, I think that kids today especially are much better at sifting through things.
Yeah. Yes.
than probably we were. And it's funny because I've always used, for decades, I've used advertising in my classes in some shape or form to show something. And often now I'll say, did you see this ad? And they're like, no. And I keep forgetting that they don't watch commercial television,
Right.
which is where they
Right.
would see most of those ads. I showed the 1984 ad for Apple.
Oh
Do you
yeah.
know that
Great
ad,
one.
the Big Brother
Of
ad,
course.
which only aired
Yeah.
once during the Super Bowl? And we were talking about they were intrigued by the ad, but we also were talking about how quickly everything has progressed. So in other
Yeah.
words, first I showed them an ad for a Commodore 64, which I think it was a 1978 ad for Radio Shack or something. And then the Mac ad in 1984. And then I showed them the Mac PC ads. Remember that campaign? I'm a Mac, I'm a
Right.
PC, with what's his name? Woodman, the
Yeah.
writer, yeah. And just and talking about the fact that all of this has happened very quickly. And if you look at the time
Yeah.
period that's elapsed, the amount of time that's elapsed, and compare it to the time that elapsed between other incredible changes. I mean, you look at, you say, the flight was 100 years ago. I mean, that's just, and now we're talking about going to Mars.
Yeah.
Um, it happens quick. And
Yeah.
the fact of the matter is that technology is able to do that more than ever. And as I always say, the question is, should we? Right?
It's a good question.
We don't give ourselves enough space and enough time to think about it and answer that question. We just say, oh, we can do that, we should. It's like, maybe not. But then it's difficult because you can't put the toothpaste back in the tube. So
Yeah.
if all of a sudden you're going to say, as some talking heads want have said in op-eds, oh, we should just outlaw AI. It shouldn't be allowed. Like, well, good luck. That's not going to happen. We need to
Right.
figure out how to live with it, maybe how to
Yeah.
regulate it. Or I don't even know if that's possible. But it needs to be a kind of an agreed upon attitude about how we're going to use this and allow it to be a factor in our lives. I mean, last year I wouldn't let my students use AI at all.
Right.
My syllabus statement was, you can't use ChatGPT. Had just come out. I said, you can't use it. After what's gone on in the last 6 months and a lot of talking about it over the summer with a lot of different people, I wrote a new policy for this year, and I'm actually encouraging them to use it now. It's part of their lives, and they're going to have to figure out how to use
Yeah.
it. But
Yeah.
I have strict guidelines for it and guardrails set up. And if they do use it, they need to note that in their piece that they're submitting, that they use ChatGPT to help in the writing of the piece or whatever the case may be. And I've told them that this is probably the future.
Yeah. Of
Um,
course.
that you no longer should overwrite your files when you write, because you might be called to account for the fact that, yeah, I wrote that. And the only way you can show that is if you keep your drafts,
Hmm.
rather than just overwriting the file when you're working on something, because you can't track the history that way. And I mean, we're seeing cases already where, big name people are being called on the carpet and saying, I think that was written by AI. And
Yep.
it's difficult to prove. That was tangential. Sorry.
No, I think it's right on the money. I read an article a while back where I forgot what school it was, but they said they were no longer going to accept dissertations that use ChatGPT. And it was just this huge backlash. Like, what do you mean I can't use that to write? And I was like, oh my God, I didn't know. Like, how can you? And at some level, it passes that sort of Turing test. Like, how do you know? How do you know?
Right.
So why not? You're going to have to embrace it on some level. does it seem more creative on some level? Is the stuff that you're seeing now used in conjunction with ChatGPT showing a different dimension?
Not yet.
Okay.
Not yet, because I don't think that I don't think we have figured out how to use it in that way yet.
Right.
It's so new, and there are so few guidelines in place that it's difficult. And I mean, when it comes to, I mean, let's just stick with ChatGPT and not talk about the
Sure.
others because it's too much. But I mean, ChatGPT is not creative. And we know that AI is going to give you the information that's going to make you happy. That's what it's trying to do.
Right.
And if it has to make that up, it's going to. They call it the hallucinatory piece, right? Where it doesn't know, so it makes it up. And we need to really be aware of that and alert to it. I mean, I ran into that not this past summer, but the year before in the work that I do with high school teachers. ChatGPT had just come out and they were all up in arms. And so I brought it up on the screen. I was doing a consulting job and I brought it up on the screen and I said, okay, what's a text that you often teach? And they said, To Kill a Mockingbird. And so I typed in, give me 10 sources for To Kill a Mockingbird. And it gave us 10 sources. And everybody was like, oh, see, it's horrible. It's horrible. And then there was a beat. And somebody in the back of the room said, wait a minute. And we looked at the list. They were all made up. They weren't real sources. And so, I mean, it's progressing. But,
Yeah.
I that was a good example of, it wants to please you.
Right. Yeah. I think it was in Timaeus where Toth talks about the inventor of a technology is not necessarily the best person to talk about what it's going to end
That's
up
right.
doing.
That's right. That's right. But, then again, I mean, look at how, Socrates was so worried about writing as a
Yeah.
thing.
Yeah.
So, I mean, any new technology has had that. There's been
Yes.
fear, right? I
Of
mean,
course.
I love the article. I have it someplace, the clipping from the New York Times in the early 1970s of, the high school math teachers on a picket line picketing against calculators,
Right.
It just, we had to figure out how to use it.
Yep. Yeah, it's so much more manageable when you look at it from that angle of like, okay, here's the next thing. Here's the next thing. And yeah, it's scary because in some level, maybe it speaks volumes of us as humans of like, it's going to do this. Like it just plays on our fears. Like we automatically go to the worst case scenario. Like it's going to do
Sure.
this,
Yeah. Yeah. Now we do go to worst case scenario.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Maybe that's what it takes. Maybe that's part of turning the ship around is for us, the people that have seen or are comfortable. We see radical change on the forefront and we're like, I just finished building this thing. Damn it. Now this thing's coming in and
well, I mean, I
it's
remember
crazy.
driving, we when I was in graduate school, we drove to I forget what it was called, but it was one of the big box stores that sold computers.
Okay.
And we were driving home and I turned to my wife in the car and I said, for the next 10 minutes, you have the best technology that's out there. By the time we unbox it, they'll have something new,
Yep.
and that's happened. I mean, it's slowed down a little bit now with computers, but
Right. Yeah. It's interesting to me just to see all these changes coming. And well, I've walked you up here, David, to the end of the hour. And
yeah.
It's so fast. Our conversations, I'm so thankful that we start off about mystics and we get into technology. But more than that, I think that we're covering a lot of really interesting topics about how life is moving. And I'm just thankful to get to be here with you. But before I let you go, what do you got coming up? Where can people find you? What are you excited about? The word on the street is you might be consulting for some tech bros here in San Francisco. And what else you got going on?
Well, I mean, I'm real excited about my teaching as I always am. Got good students this semester, which is really nice. Makes it a lot more pleasant to go into class, to be
Right.
sure. What I've got coming up, got some book signings, some other podcast gigs, some more work here with George, I'm sure, coming up.
Yes,
My wife and I are finishing up a book on angels
that's
and
great.
demons and pop culture, which I hope will be out probably next fall. We're just about finished with it. And I'm starting a new project on Carl Jung and St. Augustine. So that's
Amazing.
a long-term project that I'll be looking for a publisher for.
Very nice. Are you looking for grad students to help you on that book, or is that just a solo mission?
I'm looking for I'm always looking for help. Sure,
Yeah.
sure.
Yeah. That's that. What is, maybe can you give us a little bit more info on that project?
Yeah. So I mean, I think that both Jung and Augustine have very interesting things to say about the self,
Mm,
and in many ways, what they're saying really does overlap. And so the book that I am proposing basically is Jung reading Augustine.
wow.
So it's almost as if, the reader reading Jung through reading Augustine through Jung. A it's very meta. Um, but for but for a general audience, not an academic book, but to look at their ideas about the self and how they are somewhat similar and how they can further help us today.
I, I can't help but bring up this idea of awareness again. What a great way to get to understand two persons' point of views, like through reading it through that sort of
Yeah,
lens. Like, how did you? Is that what inspired you to do that? Have you read something like that before? Is that something you're seeing
I
with your
haven't.
students? Is
I
that a
mean,
trend or
no, I mean, in reading, I mean, I've been a big reader of both authors,
right?
and just in I teach a course on Jungian archetypes, and in rereading and reading Jung and reading more Jung all the time, I just all of a sudden it started popping up. It's like, wait a minute, that's Augustine. Augustine says that. And even though Jung, I don't think ever cites Augustine, I think he mentions him once in his
Mhm.
entire work. Um, there seems to be a lot of connection there, and I mean, it would be very Jungian to talk about the synchronicity, wouldn't it?
Absolutely. I got our friend Clint Kyle's coming in. I think you've been on his podcast and probably will be on there again, I'm sure. Clint, thanks for reaching out. And Clint has an amazing podcast called um, the Psychedelic Christian Podcast, where he gets into different mystical experiences. But he's an incredible individual. I would recommend everybody go check out Clint Kyle's. David, thank you so much for hanging out with us today. Hang on briefly afterwards. To
Sure.
everybody who spent time with us today, I hope you have a beautiful day. Go down to the show notes, check out the books already written by Dr. David Salomon. Reach out to him if you liked what we were talking about today. He does some consulting work. He is hands down one of my favorite people to talk to, and I'm thankful for your time. That's all we got, ladies and gentlemen. Aloha.